I wasn't looking for trouble when I first saw the box. In fact, I wasn't looking for anything in particular at all. It was just another Saturday at an estate sale in one of the quieter parts of town, the kind of place where people seem to live out their days in quiet retirement, surrounded by memories and trinkets that no one else cared about once they were gone. As an antique dealer, that was where I made my living, finding treasures buried in the forgotten corners of life, dusting them off and selling them to people who still found meaning in them. I was 36, barely keeping my antique shop afloat. It wasn't that I didn't love the work, I did. But love doesn't always keep the lights on. Sales had been slow for months, and I was starting to wonder if I'd have to shut the place down for good. Still, I was stubborn. I couldn't just walk away from something that had been my passion for so long. It was on that day, among the cluttered relics of someone else's past, that I found it. Or maybe it found me. The estate sale had already been picked over by the time I arrived. Tables were lined with old family photographs, yellowed lace doilies, chipped porcelain dishes. Nothing that screamed hidden gem. It was clear that this house had belonged to someone who had lived a long, full life. A Holocaust survivor, I later learned. The air in the place had a kind of weight to it, like it was holding onto stories no one had asked to hear. That's when I saw the box. It sat on a corner table, surrounded by less impressive things. At first glance, it was just an old wine cabinet, no bigger than a nightstand, with dark wood that had weathered over the years. But there was something about it, something that made me stop. I couldn't explain it, but the moment I laid eyes on it, I felt drawn. It wasn't the most extravagant piece in the house, nor the most valuable, but there was an energy about it, something heavy and unsettling that seemed to pulse from within. It felt like it had a story, and that's what intrigued me. As I was examining it, a woman approached me. She was in her late 30s, with tired eyes and a nervous smile. "That was my grandmother's," she said softly, gesturing toward the box. "It's beautiful," I replied, running my fingers over the ornate carvings on its surface. There were strange symbols etched into the wood, symbols I didn't recognize but couldn't stop tracing with my eyes. The woman hesitated before speaking again. She never let anyone touch it, always said it was cursed. I know that sounds ridiculous, but she was adamant about it. She wouldn't even let us open it after she passed. "Cursed?" I repeated, raising an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" She sighed, clearly uncomfortable. "My grandmother survived. Well, she survived some terrible things during the war, and she knew that something dark was attached to that box. She always said it contained a Dybbuk, some kind of spirit trapped inside. She warned us never to open it." A Dybbuk. I had heard the term before, vaguely. Some spirit from Jewish folklore that could possess the living, feeding on their grief and guilt. But I wasn't a believer in that sort of thing. My world was one of objects, history, and facts. Stories like that were just old superstitions, fables created to explain the things we didn't understand. Still, the way the woman looked at the box, I couldn't shake it. "Do you believe that?" I asked, half joking but also curious. She shook her head quickly. "No, I don't. But my grandmother did. She was terrified of it. I think it reminded her of things she didn't want to remember." Despite the warning, I felt that pull again. I couldn't explain why, but I wanted the box. Needed it, even. "I'll take it," I said. The woman seemed relieved as she sold it to me, almost like she was happy to see it go. I paid the asking price, loaded the box into my car, and drove it home, dismissing the uneasy feeling that lingered in the back of my mind. The first few days after I brought the box home, nothing unusual happened. It sat in my living room, where I kept the more valuable and intriguing antiques I preferred to examine in depth. I had a habit of keeping the important pieces at home, away from the shop, so I could study them in a quieter, more personal environment. The box blended in with the rest of my collection, and every now and then I would glance at it, curious about the stories it might hold. But despite the history and the warning that came with it, I didn't feel the same unease I had sensed at the estate sale. Maybe it was just my imagination. Maybe I had let the woman's warning get to me more than I realized. But then things started to change. It was subtle at first, a flickering light, a sudden chill in the room, the faintest sound of whispers that I couldn't quite place. But it was enough to make me feel on edge, enough to make me wonder if there was more to that box than I had first thought. It was late one night when my curiosity got the best of me. I had been staring at the box for hours, the strange symbols carved into its surface pulling me in. My hands itched to know what was inside. What was so terrible that the old woman had spent her life warning her family never to open it? I told myself it was just a box, just wood and metal. Whatever was inside was just an old collection of trinkets. The warning had stuck with me, but I couldn't let it stop me. With a sense of anticipation I hadn't felt in years, I unlocked the cabinet. Inside, I found several small objects that seemed to have no connection to one another. A golden goblet, a smooth stone inscribed with symbols, a dried flower, 2 locks of hair, a small statue marked with Hebrew writing, and a candlestick. Each piece was delicate, old, and worn. But more than that, they were personal. It was as though these objects had once belonged to someone who had lived through something unimaginable. I picked up the locks of hair, running my fingers over the brittle strands, wondering who they belonged to. The thought of the Holocaust survivor and her warnings echoed in my mind, but I pushed it away. It was just an old woman's superstition, nothing more. That night I started having some eerie dreams. I was in a dimly lit room, the air thick with the smell of smoke and sweat. Shadowy figures moved around me, their faces blurred and indistinct, but their presence was suffocating. I felt trapped, surrounded by a darkness I couldn't escape. In the distance, I could hear the faint sounds of sobbing, of people crying out in fear and pain. It wasn't just a nightmare. It felt real. When I woke up, my body was drenched in sweat, my heart racing. The dream had clung to me, the images still fresh in my mind. I could still hear the whispers in the back of my head, faint but insistent. I glanced over at the box, sitting in the corner of my room. It wasn't just a box. Something had changed. The days that followed blurred together. The nightmares came more frequently, always filled with the same shadowy figures and the same oppressive sense of dread. My body began to feel the strain, constant headaches, nosebleeds, and a heavy fatigue that seemed to settle deep in my bones. No amount of sleep or medication seemed to help. And then there were the whispers. At first, they were barely noticeable, just a faint murmuring at the edge of my awareness. But as the days passed, they grew louder, more persistent. They followed me everywhere, filling the silence with their eerie cadence. I couldn't understand the words, but I could feel their weight. It was like they were trying to tell me something I didn't want to hear. I became obsessed with the box, spending hours researching its origins, trying to make sense of what was happening to me. That's when I stumbled across the concept of the Dybbuk, a restless spirit from Jewish folklore that could possess the living, attaching itself to objects to cause chaos. The more I read about Dybbuks, the deeper I spiraled. The stories were too similar to what I was experiencing. These spirits, according to legend, were souls who had died violently or with unresolved guilt. They could become trapped between worlds, attaching themselves to objects like the box I had brought home. The thought of this malevolent spirit latching onto me was absurd, but as the days passed, I couldn't shake the growing sense that the box was more than just an antique. The symptoms started to worsen. Every time I was near the box, my head throbbed with a dull ache that would quickly escalate into searing pain. My nosebleeds became more frequent, staining tissues dark red almost every morning. The fatigue. It was suffocating. I'd sleep for hours, only to wake up feeling more exhausted than when I went to bed. The whispers in my dreams grew louder, and sometimes I'd wake up in the middle of the night, gasping for breath, certain I wasn't alone in the room. It wasn't just the physical symptoms. My apartment, which had always been a safe haven for me, now felt wrong. The atmosphere was heavy, like the air had been sucked out of the place, leaving behind a stifling weight. The lights flickered more often, and no matter how many times I replaced the bulbs, the problem persisted. I started hearing soft taps and scratches too. At first, they were easy to dismiss, an old building settling, maybe mice in the walls. But after a while, they became too distinct, too rhythmic, like something was moving around the apartment just out of sight. And the box, it seemed to have a life of its own. Every day, it felt like it was in a different place. I'd swear I left it in the living room, only to find it sitting on the kitchen counter, or even next to my bed. I didn't want to admit that I was afraid of it, but the growing sense of dread was becoming impossible to ignore. It wasn't just an old relic anymore. It was something far more dangerous. I needed answers. The nightmares weren't letting up. I knew I had to dig deeper. I needed to find out more about the box, its history, and its previous owner. That's when I remembered the granddaughter of the Holocaust survivor who had sold it to me. She had mentioned the box's dark history, and now I needed to know everything she knew. I was about to call her, my fingers trembling as I dialed the number she had given me at the estate sale. My heart raced, unsure of what I was hoping to find out, but knowing that I had to get to the bottom of it. She picked up after the first ring, almost like she had been expecting the call. "It's about the box, isn't it?" Her voice had that same uneasy tone I had heard before, but now there was something else, something darker, more resigned. "Yes," I said. "I need to know more. I need to know what I've brought into my home." There was a pause on the other end, and for a moment I thought the line had gone dead. But then she sighed, a heavy, tired sound that carried the weight of something much larger than either of us. "I should have told you everything before," she began quietly, "but I didn't want to scare you off. The truth is, you aren't the first person to buy the box." My heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" "Several people bought it before you," she continued, her voice growing shakier. "Every time someone purchased it, they returned it. Some within days, some after weeks, but they always came back. Each of them claimed that strange things happened when they brought it home, things they couldn't explain. It got to the point where I couldn't sell it anymore. No one wanted it. My family didn't know what to do with it, but we couldn't destroy it either. My grandmother always said that if we tried to get rid of it in the wrong way, the spirit inside would only grow stronger." I swallowed hard, my mouth suddenly dry. "Why didn't you tell me this when I bought it?" "I didn't think you'd believe me," she admitted. "And I needed it gone. You seemed skeptical, like none of this would matter to you. I thought maybe you'd be different, that you'd just see it as another antique. But I should have known better. The box doesn't care if you believe in it or not." I sat down heavily on the edge of my couch, staring at the box across the room. It was sitting on the coffee table, untouched but somehow menacing, as if it was listening to every word of our conversation. "What exactly happened to the others?" I asked, almost afraid of the answer. "They all experienced the same things," she said. "Nightmares, voices, shadowy figures following them. But one thing was the same for all of them. Something in their lives fell apart. Some lost their jobs. Others had their relationships destroyed. One man's wife left him after he started talking about seeing things in the middle of the night. He said the box moved on its own, that it was always somewhere different when he woke up, and there was another. Another? He died. Heart failure, they said. But before he died, he told his brother that the box had cursed him, that it was feeding on him. The air in the room seemed to grow heavier, the temperature dropping around me. I could feel the weight of her words settling deep into my bones. I looked at the box, and for the first time, I truly felt the fear she had warned me about. "I've been seeing things too," I confessed, my voice barely above a whisper. Hearing things, nightmares. I thought it was just stress, but now, I don't know. There was a long silence on the other end of the line before she spoke again, her voice barely audible. You need to get rid of it, but you need to be careful. If you don't handle it the right way, it'll keep coming back. It'll find you. I hung up the phone, my mind reeling. The box had a history, one far darker and more dangerous than I could have ever imagined. I wasn't just dealing with an old wine cabinet. I was dealing with something ancient, something that had claimed others before me, and now it had its claws in me. But I wasn't ready to give up yet. There had to be a way out of this. I started researching everything I could about Dybbuks and Jewish folklore, desperate to understand what I had unleashed. The more I read, the more terrified I became. Dybbuks were not just spirits. They were souls of the dead, trapped between worlds, unable to move on because of the violence or suffering they endured in life. They could attach themselves to objects, waiting for someone to disturb them. Once disturbed, they would possess the living, feeding off their guilt, their trauma, until they were consumed. I didn't want to believe it. I wanted to be rational, to tell myself that this was all just superstition. But the signs were all there. The nightmares, the headaches, the strange occurrences, and now, the knowledge that others had gone through the same thing, some even losing their lives. My next step was tracking down the people who had returned the box, hoping they could give me more insight into what I was dealing with. It wasn't easy. Many of them were reluctant to talk about their experiences, and a few refused outright, saying they wanted nothing more to do with the box or anything connected to it. But I persisted, desperate for answers. The first person I spoke to was a man named Daniel, who had purchased the box a few years before me. He was hesitant at first, but after some convincing, he agreed to meet me at a small cafe in the city. When I arrived, I barely recognized him from the picture I had seen online. He looked older, worn down, like the weight of the world had been pressing on him for years. His eyes darted nervously around the room as we spoke, as though he expected something, or someone, to be watching. "You've got the box now, don't you?" he asked quietly, his voice low and trembling. I nodded. "Yeah, I bought it a few weeks ago. Things started happening almost immediately." Daniel let out a long breath, leaning back in his chair. "I'm not surprised. That thing, it's cursed, man. I don't know how else to describe it. I had it for a month before I returned it. It nearly ruined my life." He went on to explain how his health had deteriorated rapidly after bringing the box home. It started with the headaches and nightmares, just like me. Then, strange things began happening around his house. Objects moving on their own, lights flickering, doors creaking open in the middle of the night. His relationship with his girlfriend fell apart. She left him, convinced he was losing his mind. "But it wasn't just the stuff in my house," he said, his voice growing more frantic. "I started seeing things, shadows, people that weren't there. They'd just watch me. I thought I was going crazy, but it wasn't just in my head. That box, it feeds on you. The longer you have it, the worse it gets." Another owner, a woman named Claire, shared a similar experience. She had returned the box within days, too frightened by the overwhelming sense of dread it brought into her home. She described seeing shadowy figures in mirrors and windows, always lurking just out of sight. "It felt like it was feeding off me," she said, her voice shaking. "I couldn't breathe in my own home. I had to get rid of it before it took more." Every person I spoke to had the same story, haunted by something they couldn't explain, something that felt alive, lurking inside the box. Some had tried to destroy it, but every time they attempted to, something stopped them. Accidents, injuries, strange occurrences that prevented them from breaking the curse. It was becoming clear that the box was no ordinary antique. It was a prison for something far darker, and now it was my turn to suffer. I had to understand why it had latched onto me. What was it feeding on? What was it drawing from me? As I delved deeper into the history of Dybbuks, I learned that they didn't just attach themselves to anyone. They sought out those with guilt, those who carried a weight they couldn't let go of. And that's when it hit me, my own guilt, my own failures. The mistakes I had made in my life, the betrayals, the regrets I had tried so hard to bury. Was that what the Dybbuk was feeding on? Was that why it had latched onto me? I thought about my family, the strained relationships, the distance I had created over the years. I had never been close to my parents after the death of my brother, a loss that had shattered us all. I carried guilt over that, guilt that I hadn't been there for them, that I hadn't done enough to keep my family together. And now, it was all coming back to haunt me. The box wasn't just an object, it was a mirror, reflecting everything I had tried to forget, and the Dybbuk inside was feeding on it, growing stronger with every passing day. I knew I couldn't keep the box any longer, but getting rid of it wasn't going to be as easy as I thought. Every time I tried to move it, to put it away or throw it out, something stopped me, an overwhelming sense of dread, a sharp pain that radiated through my body, as if the box itself was fighting back. I was trapped, just like the others had been. The apartment had become a living nightmare. The longer I kept the box, the more distorted my world became. What had started as faint whispers and flickering lights had now escalated into something far darker, something malevolent. It felt like the walls themselves were closing in on me, like the very air had been poisoned by the presence of the box. Every night I could hear it, a soft, insistent whisper that grew louder as I tried to sleep. It sounded like a chorus of voices, all murmuring in unison, but I couldn't understand the words. The language was foreign, ancient, but the intent behind it was unmistakable: malice. I hadn't slept in days, maybe weeks. The lines between my dreams and waking life had started to blur. Even in the daylight, I felt like I was being watched, like something was following me from room to room. The shadows in my apartment seemed to stretch longer, darker, and out of the corner of my eye. I could see them moving, skittering along the walls like something alive. But the worst part was the box itself. It no longer stayed where I left it. I would set it down in one room and find it in another the next morning. Sometimes I would hear the faint creak of its hinges, as if it was opening on its own. But whenever I checked, it was always closed. The objects inside remained undisturbed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was moving within it, something that was waiting to be let out. One night, after yet another restless evening, I woke up drenched in sweat. The whispers had grown louder, filling my bedroom with their dissonant hum. The air was thick, oppressive, and the scent of rotting flowers and something foul, cat urine maybe, was so strong that it stung my nose. I bolted upright, gasping for breath, but as I did, my gaze fell on the box. It was there, right next to my bed. I hadn't put it there, I was sure of that. My heart pounded in my chest as I stared at it, unable to look away. The room felt colder now, the temperature plummeting as the shadows around the box seemed to ripple, like something was stirring beneath them. And then, I saw it. A hand, pale and thin, with fingers impossibly long, creeping out from behind the box. It moved slowly, deliberately, as if testing the air, and I could see the nails, dark, almost black, cracked and jagged. My breath caught in my throat as the hand curled around the edge of the box, its fingers scraping softly against the wood. For a moment, everything was still. The hand paused, as if waiting for something, before it suddenly withdrew, vanishing into the shadows like it had never been there at all. I froze, my body paralyzed with fear, the whispers growing louder, more insistent. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. All I could do was stare at the box, the knowledge that something was inside, watching me. I started seeing them everywhere. The shadow figures weren't just confined to the edges of my vision anymore. They followed me now, openly, standing in the corners of my apartment, their dark forms barely visible in the dim light. At first they were just silhouettes, amorphous shapes that hovered near the walls, their presence unnerving but distant. But then they began to take form. One evening, as I sat on the couch trying to distract myself with the TV, I felt a sudden chill. The lights flickered, and out of the corner of my eye, I saw one of the shadows move. Slowly, it stepped forward, emerging from the darkness. Its shape was humanoid, but distorted. Its limbs too long, its posture hunched and unnatural. The figure didn't have a face, just a blank, smooth surface where its features should have been. I stared, my heart thudding in my chest as it moved closer, its form barely perceptible but undeniably there. My breath hitched as it stopped just a few feet away from me, its head tilted slightly, as if it was observing me, studying me. The lights flickered again, and in the brief moment of darkness, it was gone. But the cold lingered. The Dybbuk wasn't just haunting me, it was trying to break me. The headaches were worse now, sharp and blinding, often accompanied by sudden nosebleeds. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, choking on the thick, oppressive air, my ears ringing with the sound of whispers. My reflection in the mirror looked more gaunt, more hollow, like the life was slowly being drained out of me. And then came the visions. They started small, flashes of images that I couldn't quite place. A hand reaching out of the shadows, a door slowly creaking open, an unfamiliar face staring at me from the darkness. But as the days passed, the visions grew more vivid, more real. I started to lose track of time. Sometimes I'd blink and find myself standing in a different room, unsure of how I got there. Other times I'd hear voices, clear and distinct, calling my name. One night, while brushing my teeth, trying to keep my routine as normal as possible, I noticed something strange. My reflection was off, just slightly. I raised my hand to touch my face, and for a split second, the reflection didn't follow. It just stared at me, unblinking, its eyes darker than they should have been. And then all my features disappeared. My face was smooth. No eyes, no nose, no mouth. I stumbled back, dropping my toothbrush, but my reflection didn't move. It stayed still, that featureless face. I backed out of the bathroom, my heart pounding in my ears. The box was gaining power. By now, I couldn't avoid it. The box followed me, appearing in different rooms, no matter where I left it. Its presence was suffocating, like a weight pressing down on my chest. Every time I tried to move it out of sight, to put it in the attic or lock it away, something stopped me. A sudden sharp pain would shoot through my body, or a wave of nausea would hit, forcing me to leave it where it was. The voices in my head grew louder. Sometimes they spoke directly to me, whispering my name, telling me to open the box again. Other times they would scream, a cacophony of noise that made it impossible to think. I tried covering the box with blankets, sealing it in a wooden crate, anything to stop the sound, but the whispers always found a way through. It was one particularly cold night, colder than usual, when I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I had to confront it. The box, the Dybbuk, whatever was inside, it was destroying me from the inside out. I could feel it. The lights flickered as I stood before the box, its dark wood gleaming in the faint glow of the lamp. My hands trembled as I reached for the lid, every instinct in my body screaming at me to stop, to turn back, but I couldn't. I had to know what it wanted. Just as my fingers brushed the surface, I heard it, a voice, low and guttural, emanating from the box itself.
"Let me out."
I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. The voice wasn't just in my head anymore. It was real, tangible, and it was coming from inside the box. The temperature in the room plummeted, and I could see my breath in the air, forming misty clouds. The lights flickered again, casting long, distorted shadows on the walls. The air grew thick with the smell of rotting flowers and something much worse, something decayed, like a corpse left too long in the open. And then, the box opened on its own. I didn't see it happen. One moment, the lid was closed, and the next, it was wide open, revealing the strange artifacts inside. But they weren't just objects anymore. They pulsed with energy, vibrating softly, like they were alive. That's when I saw it. A shadow, tall, impossibly tall, standing in the corner of the room, just beyond the reach of the light. Its shape was barely human, its limbs twisted and elongated. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel its eyes on me, cold and unforgiving. The shadow moved closer, its form flickering in and out of existence, as if it was struggling to stay in this world. My heart raced, my breath coming in ragged gasps, but I couldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, frozen in fear. As the figure loomed over me, I heard the voice again, clearer this time, filling the room with its presence.
You can't escape.
I knew then that I couldn't fight this alone. I needed help, real help, spiritual help. After that night, I knew I couldn't handle this alone. The box was far beyond my understanding, far beyond anything I could manage by myself. The dark presence in my apartment had grown stronger, more oppressive. The whispers were no longer confined to the dead of night. They followed me throughout the day, always at the edge of my hearing, gnawing at my sanity. I spent the next day searching for help. I couldn't go to a doctor. How could I explain what was happening to me without sounding insane? No therapist could treat this. No. I needed someone who understood what the box was, who knew about the Dybbuk and the curse that had been unleashed. That's when I found a local rabbi who specialized in spiritual matters, exorcisms in particular. He was my last hope. I called him immediately, barely able to keep the desperation out of my voice as I explained the situation. I didn't tell him everything, just enough for him to know I was serious. To my relief, he agreed to meet me that same evening. I didn't mention the box on the phone, but I could hear something shift in his voice the moment I described the presence in my home. He knew what I was dealing with. The rabbi's house was a modest, quiet place, tucked into a residential street that seemed worlds away from the chaos in my life. When I arrived, he welcomed me inside, his expression calm but cautious, as though he had already sensed the darkness I carried with me. "You've disturbed something ancient," he said, his eyes scanning me as though I was already tainted, "something that is not easily put to rest." I nodded, too exhausted to argue. "I didn't mean to," I whispered. "I didn't know." "No one ever does," he said softly. "But that doesn't make the consequences any less real." I explained everything to him, the estate sale, the box, the warnings, the strange occurrences. I told him about the shadow figures, the whispers, the growing feeling that something was watching me, waiting for me to slip up. As I spoke, his expression darkened. He told me that Dybbuks were more than just lost spirits. They were souls bound by intense guilt, pain, or hatred, unable to pass on. And once they found a host, they latched onto that person's vulnerabilities, feeding on their fears and weaknesses until they consumed them. "The box is a vessel," he said, leaning forward, "but it's more than just an object. It's a prison, and by opening it, you've allowed the spirit inside to begin its work." I felt a cold dread settle over me. "Can we put it back? Can we seal it away?" He didn't answer right away. His eyes flickered with doubt. "Perhaps," he said carefully, "but it won't be easy. The spirit is already attached to you. It will resist. It will fight." "Then let's do it," I said, my voice trembling. "Whatever it takes." That evening, the rabbi came to my apartment. He brought with him an assortment of religious items, a Torah scroll, a shofar, candles, and a small vial of oil. I watched nervously as he prepared the space, lighting the candles and muttering prayers under his breath. The box sat on the table in the center of the room, silent and still, but I could feel the weight of its presence bearing down on me like a physical force. As the rabbi began to chant in Hebrew, the air around us seemed to change. The temperature dropped sharply, and the familiar scent of rotting flowers and decay filled the room. I shivered, pulling my jacket tighter around me, but no amount of warmth could chase away the cold that was creeping into my bones. The rabbi's voice grew louder, more forceful, as he circled the box, his chants echoing off the walls. The candles flickered violently, casting long, distorted shadows across the room, and then, without warning, the lights exploded, one by one, The bulbs shattered, plunging us into darkness. I gasped, my heart racing, but the rabbi didn't stop. His chanting continued, even as the shadows in the room seemed to pulse and shift. I could feel them moving now, skittering across the walls, slithering toward us like living creatures. And then I saw it. The shadowy figure from before, tall, hunched, and inhuman, emerged from the darkness, its eyes glowing faintly in the flickering candlelight. It loomed over the box, its form shifting and distorting, as if it was struggling to remain in this world. My breath hitched in my throat, my legs frozen in place as I watched the thing approach. The rabbi's voice faltered, his eyes widening in fear as the figure drew closer. The Dybbuk was fighting back, resisting the ritual with everything it had. "Stay strong," the rabbi shouted, his voice strained. "Do not give in to its fear." But it was hard not to. The whispers were louder now, screaming in my ears, filling my head with a cacophony of voices that drowned out everything else. My vision blurred, and for a moment, I was no longer in my apartment. I was somewhere else, somewhere dark and suffocating. I could see the faces of people I had never met, their eyes wide with terror, their mouths twisted in silent screams. I was in a concentration camp standing among the dead. I could feel the weight of their pain, their suffering pressing down on me, threatening to crush me under the weight of it all. The guilt, the trauma, it was overwhelming. I couldn't breathe. And then, just as quickly as the vision had come, it was gone. I was back in my apartment, the shadowy figure looming over me, its presence suffocating. The rabbi was still chanting, but his voice was fading, drowned out by the whispers. The Dybbuk was winning, but I couldn't let it. Summoning every ounce of strength I had left, I reached for the box. My hands trembled as I grabbed hold of it, the wood cold and slick beneath my fingers. The moment I touched it, a searing pain shot through my body, as if the Dybbuk was trying to burn me from the inside out. But I didn't let go. With a final desperate cry, the rabbi raised the shofar to his lips and blew a long, piercing note. The sound cut through the darkness, slicing through the whispers like a knife. The shadow figure recoiled, its form flickering violently, as if it was being torn apart. The box rattled in my hands, the lid slamming shut with a deafening crack. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the room went still. The air was thick with the smell of burnt wax and something else, something foul like the remnants of a long-dead fire. I collapsed onto the floor, gasping for breath, my body shaking with exhaustion. The Dybbuk was gone, or at least I hoped it was. The rabbi knelt beside me, his face pale and drawn. "It's sealed," he whispered, "for now." I looked at the box, its lid firmly shut, the strange symbols on its surface glowing faintly in the candlelight. It was over. The Dybbuk was contained, but something in the rabbi's voice left me unsettled. "For now?" I asked, my voice weak. The rabbi nodded slowly, his eyes dark with understanding. "The Dybbuk feeds on guilt, on trauma. It thrives in darkness. As long as the box remains closed, it cannot escape. But if you are not careful, if you let your guard down, it may find a way back in." I shuddered, my mind racing. The box was sealed, but the Dybbuk wasn't gone. It was still there, waiting. The rabbi stood, gathering his things. "Keep the box hidden," he said, "and never under any circumstances open it again." I did as he instructed. I locked the box away, sealing it in a wooden crate and burying it deep in the back of my closet. But no matter how far I pushed it from my mind, I could never fully escape it. The days that followed were quiet, but the damage had been done. I was different now, haunted. The nightmares still came, though less frequently. The whispers, once deafening, had faded to a low murmur, barely audible but always there, lurking at the edge of my consciousness. I tried to move on, to live my life as if nothing had changed. But the truth was, I couldn't forget. The box, the Dybbuk, it had left its mark on me, and I knew it was only a matter of time before the box called to me again. Some nights, as I lay in bed, I'd hear a faint creak from the closet. Just the sound of the house settling, I'd tell myself. But then the lights would flicker, just for a moment. And in the silence, I could swear I heard it. The faintest whisper,